Good morning, everybody, and happy Minna Kant's Day. Welcome to EY organized webinar. The Science-Based Target Initiative has released updated net zero standards, and today you're about to hear what you need to know. And you can ask questions throughout the webinar. We have a chat box on the right-hand side of your screen, so feel free to post any questions during the presentation. We try to answer them at least the latest in the latter part of the webinar. My name is Lauri Larvus, and I'm heading the Sustainability Advisory here at EY Finland. Been working around these topics for the past 15 years. And these are the speakers of the day. In addition to me, unfortunately, Kiira couldn't make it today, fell sick, but we have Elisa here joining as a substance matter expert. So Elisa, would you introduce yourself as well?
Yes, thank you, Lauri. Great to see you all online. My name is Elisa Sivulagan, and I work as a manager in our Climate Change and Sustainability Services team. I've worked about 5 years now with climate and nature topics around SBTi as well, target setting and decarbonization roadmaps and transition plans. So great to be here with you now and giving insights on the SBTi.
Thank you, Elisa. Let's move forward. So on today's agenda, we have 1 hour time. We will go through a little bit of the context, then just a short reminder that what SBTi is and why does it really matter. We will have the key updates and changes for the requirements, and then implications and next steps. And as mentioned, in the end, we have the Q&A session, but please feel free to post your questions and comments already in the chat. And if you have any kind of questions also after this event, we're happy to answer those as well. But what is SBTi and why does it really matter? So sharing a context here. So obviously now more than ever, the climate action is really something that companies need to do, and it's not only fun and games, but it's a strategic initiative where actually the target setting is the first critical part of the transition journey. We see a lot of extreme weather events becoming more frequent and severe across the globe. Despite all of the regulatory changes in EU politics and globally, the true impacts of climate change they are not going anywhere. So the fundamentals are still the same. And then companies really need to think about how they set their targets, how do they mitigate their impacts throughout the value chain, and also how do they adapt to the changes that the operative environment is facing due to the climate change and nature decline. So at least what we have heard and what we see is that companies are moving forward with these targets and target settings. Also, we see a good progress in taking climate action more closer to the corporate strategy, and it's more integrated into business and operations. Of course, due to the global disruptions, of course, the kind of supply chain impacts are also highly relevant in this case, and dependency on fossil fuels, as we have witnessed during the past weeks, is still a big business disruptor. So we need to decarbonize and decouple from using fossil energy and also fossil-based raw materials. As said, setting the target is the first step, and then creating a robust transition plans also where the corporate-wide capital allocation is taking into consideration to make it actually actionable is is crucial, and also maintaining the momentum in the sustainability journey when it comes to decarbonizing and adapting to climate change related impacts. And as a reminder, I think we all know in this audience is that the inaction also might be very costly. And based on our recently published EY Global Climate Action Barometer, we see that climate inaction can be quite costly to businesses. So with future inaction, estimated costs can be 15% of the annualized revenue on average. Might be more, might be less, but we cannot afford doing nothing. And then moving a bit forward, so as I mentioned, we see good progress, and especially in the Nordics, but globally as well. So we see that companies are setting targets. They have a strategic priority on climate action, and we see actual progress in mitigating the emissions and also adaptation readiness. But there are several gaps as well, and the progress is limited. We need to accelerate moving forward, and also this requires investments, not only setting targets, but the transition plan needs to take into consideration the investments needed and the business case behind it. So I want to share a few facts based on EY surveys as well. Not going to go through all of them just to save time for the actual content as well, but just highlighting that according to our surveys, 92% of companies have already analyzed the qualitative and quantitative impacts of physical risks, or both, so both quantitative and qualitative, but only 44% of the companies say that they have actual adaptation measures in place. So companies have recognized that there is a need to adapt, but actually not half of them have actual measures in place. And then if I take the other example from the right-hand side, 69% of the companies with net zero targets are aiming to achieve them by 2050, 25 years from now, and only 30% are committing to achieve them before 2030. So that sets the pace also for the transition in this case. So I think there's still room for improvement to build the resilience and robust strategy-based client action. And also when it comes to financials related to risks, 68% of companies report having undertaken qualitative risk assessment of climate risks, but again, only 17% of them have actually disclosed the financial impact of those risks. And of course, that is one of the key drivers that we add the monetary values of the potential impacts and risks so that we can actually take them forward, design investments, and also have a robust transition planning going forward. So that is one key factor how to actually accelerate in addition to setting those targets. But there are a lot of many other facts which I'm quite sure that you are aware of, and you can access the EY Global Climate Action Barometer survey as well to find more of these details if you wish. And of course, we are happy to discuss this after the webinar as well. But without further ado, I think we should dive deeper into the actual updates of the net zero standards. So Elisa, would you guide us through the next steps? Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you, Lauri. Yeah, thank you for setting the scene. I think it's very important to know where the market is currently at and what do we see with the target setting and decarbonization. But yes, briefly about SBTi, we are going to ground you on what SBTi is and why does it matter. Most of you probably do know SBTi and have maybe already set targets as well. But SBTi is one of the most widely used voluntary frameworks. There is, of course, others, but it is for setting the corporate greenhouse gas reduction targets in line with the climate science and particularly with the 1.5 degree goal of the Paris Agreement. It has a methodology and criteria and validation process for companies to use when assessing their targets. And companies are increasingly responding to a broader set of pressures as well, including other such as regulation and investor expectations and customer demands, physical climate impacts. So SBTi is just one of these mechanisms to use to navigate this landscape. And what makes this relevant today is also the growing expectation regarding climate targets in these regulations as well. There's a need for credible and science-informed action that needs to be taken as well towards these targets. As we can see from the slide here, there is a growing number of companies globally that have either committed or are in the validation process for science-based targets. There is not as much validations for the net zero targets, but those are also growing. So we see an increased amount of targets for the net zero, not only for the near-term targets. Yes, going to the next slide. And with that, let's take a look on SBTi's, how it's traditionally structured, its targets, and then we will go and see what has changed. So here is a slide that summarizes the current SBTi architecture for near-term and long-term targets. And many of you may be already familiar with it and have the targets validated and set. Currently, the near-term targets focus on the next 5 to 10 years and must be then aligned with the long-term net zero ambition then. There is a little different coverage ratios for scope 1 and 2 and then for scope 3 coverages by the emissions. And then we also have the long-term targets that companies can make for net zero by 2050 at the latest, which require a minimum 90% reduction across the value chain, and then neutralization and crediting the residual emissions. This has been working fine with the current set, but in practice, SBTi has also seen challenges. For example, around the scope 3 relevance, target credibility and delivery. We see that many companies have challenges in reaching their near-term targets, or maybe they are needing to push them forward. So therefore, there was a conclusion that there should be some updates made to the current standards to address any of these challenges that companies are facing. Good. Next, we are going to go through some of the updates then that we see for the current net zero standard. So the corporate net zero standards was released in 2023. It was to create a consistent definition of what net zero means for companies. And since then, of course, there's been involvement in the net zero standard and how companies set targets with this existing framework. So because it's advanced and there's expectations from regulators and investors that have increased, they identified areas where a standard could be more clearer and robust. And that's why SBTi now launched the version 2.0. And the goal was to completely not to completely reinvent the system, but to essentially strengthen the transparency and accountability of the standard and see what the real world impact would actually be. So we want to help the companies reach those targets and not only just set those targets and then not reach them. There was a previous version of this that then got responses from extensive stakeholder feedback, and now they've released the second version of this draft. It's still a draft version and therefore can have changes still upcoming. But this is already a good time to look at the standard if this is relevant for you. For example, if you have ongoing targets and you're looking to do a new submissions, for example, because you need to update your targets, or then you haven't yet submitted or for this validation, but are looking to in the future. For the timeline, I will go to the next slide. Here, in short, companies can still continue using the current standard that is available for the next couple of years. So the near-term targets set under the existing rules remain still valid, and they will be valid until they need to have a mandatory review or update that you need to do. And if this is after the 2028, then it is said that this would be valid from the January 1st of 2028, and therefore then mandatory for all new target submissions and revalidation after this date. What this means then is that companies should already be planning ahead. So if you are expecting an update or reset target around or after 2028, you can start aligning your data already, and especially transition plan and governance with the new requirements in advance. Or then if you are wanting to use still the current version, you know that you still have this 2 years time to set the validation under the current standard. Good. Then we will move on to the main takeaways from the SBTi new draft standard. This slide pulls together the most important changes and then where the shifts become visible. So first I would like to highlight that there are now differentiated more clearly the company size and geography with stricter mandatory elements for large companies in high income countries and then less kind of mandatory points for medium size or smaller companies. The company size is determined to category A and category B companies, and this is based on a threshold where large companies are those exceeding the 450 million net turnover and 1,000 employees, very similar to the CSRD thresholds. And then medium and small companies have a lower than threshold to that. Good to note here is that if you are in a high income country, you will still be a category A company, even though you would be a medium company. So it is good to look through the thresholds and see which type of company you would fall into or which category you would fall into, because this will then impact your criteria that you would follow. Secondly, I want to highlight the accountability through the validation and performance review model. We have it highlighted here on the below. So targets are no longer just set and left untouched. There is progress and underperformance and these different metrics that need to be followed, and the validation process is a bit more clearer now and is an ongoing process that is continuously developed. Then next, there is also important technical updates, which we will go through some of them for scope 1, 2, and 3 on the following slides, but I would like to highlight that there is a separation of scope 1 and 2 targets. So previously, this has been set as one, so there is a combined scope 1 and 2 target, and now it would need to be separated under these new draft guidances. There is also revised electricity requirement focusing on low carbon alignment, and then a bit more pragmatic approach for scope 2, emphasizing kind of the relevance of the emissions in your value chain, which is the scope 3. There is also an evolution on the ongoing emissions and how to account for the beyond value chain mitigation and removals. So this has been changed into this new single framework that has some new rules around neutralization and responsibility with those removals of the emissions that cannot be reduced anymore through your own actions. The direction is to have more credible and actionable linkage between the targets and then the actual decarbonization and transition plan. So there would actually be real-world emission reductions. This does, however, bring more work as well for companies, so this is good to note within your company if you are looking to set targets with the new framework.
Elisa, I think we have one clarifying question which you probably might be able to answer as we go. We also take questions in the end, but we have one question saying that what does it mean, the GHG inventory assurance requirements that you mentioned on the previous slide?
Yes, good comment. So the new draft has also the GHG assurance requirements. So your base year needs to be assured by a limited assurance, and then kind of progress towards the target also needs to be assured. So there is going to be these spots where you also need to verify and maybe update your targets, and those need to be also assured. This is for, if I remember correctly, for the category A companies that have the assurance criteria. And this is also something that is good to take into consideration when setting the target that SBTi will require independent limited assurance. Good. So then we will go through some of the highlights for scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3 targets. And on this slide, we will see what are the updates of the second consultation draft for the net zero standard. The key point here on the second draft is that the scope 1 options for reductions are more clearer, and there is more kind of range of the methods of how to get those reduction options. There is not only this mainly one default pathway, instead there is other methods as well. So here we have pictured the linear linear option, which is probably very familiar to many of you, and this is when you reduce Scope 1 emissions in a linear pathway to net zero, kind of reducing by a defined amount each year. It's a simple way to also understand the reductions and then sometimes operationalize these as well. But in addition, there is also 2 additional methods as well that you can see on the slide. Firstly, I can present the alignment type approach. So there is an increase in the share of low carbon activities over time. And this means that it is useful for sectors where business transformation is better expressed through the activity shift rather than pure absolute reductions year on year. For example, changing the mix of technologies or fuels, fleets, or production processes. It means that the core idea is that the target is expressed through a rising proportion of low carbon activity across different time frames, and not just that the emissions will reduce linearly. Then there is also the asset decarbonization plan option, and this is designed for companies with material physical assets such as sites or fleets or industrial equipment where the reductions depend on these assets and, for example, turnover cycles. It might include also that you are dependent on technological readiness or specific investment plans in the future to decarbonize. So this means that you have a method also to utilize this as one of your Scope 1 reductions options. It is a roadmap to decarbonize assets through a given time frame. Yes. So what this makes is that then the Scope 1 target setting is more implementable for different business models, not only to certain ones, and companies can then reduce emissions based on different methods and based on their technology or activity base. And we can see also that companies do decarbonize based on their investment cycles. So this is also reflecting that change, that their SBTi is recognizing that sometimes the business cannot decarbonize year on year, but they do need to take into consideration their investment timeframes as well. Yes, then we also have highlighted in here that the Scope 1 targets remain expected across companies and that category A companies need to also set the long-term targets to reach the residual emission levels across assets by the 2050 or sooner. For category B companies, this is more optional. So here you can see that there is different kind of requirements for different sized companies. Moving on to Scope 2 targets. With here, the draft is trying to strengthen the integrity and comparability between companies. One of the shift is emphasis on alignment to 100% low carbon electricity by 2040 at the latest. So the shift is about less about the simply reporting Scope 2 emissions and more about how the pathway towards the low carbon supply looks like. They have also removed, so in the earlier draft, they had a requirement for location-based and market-based target setting, so you would have had to have both targets, but this is now removed, and the emphasis is given to the low carbon target. It was previously mentioned as zero carbon, but this was also now removed. And the low carbon, if you are wondering what does it mean, then it is defined using a threshold. So it is, you need to have less than 0.024 kilograms of CO2 per kilowatt hour. So a technical threshold there of what a low carbon electricity is. And this is important, this threshold, because then it makes it clear the divide between if you just state greener electricity or, for example, zero carbon electricity. But we are truly wanting to see the electricity aligned with this threshold, which sets the ambition of this standard. Then another practical point is how companies demonstrate this alignment in procurement. The draft tightens the use of the contractual instruments, for example, guarantee of origins or energy certificates. It introduces stronger expectations around these certificates. You may be already familiar with the Scope 2 TOG protocols criteria on what you need to fulfill in order to utilize these market-based instruments and certificates. So this is good to note that some companies, for example, utilize this criteria and lists that all of their certificates and contracts are fulfilling these criteria. We want to see more audible traces of the electricity as well, and strengthen the idea of the geographical match as well. And this is essentially that it's not just enough to buy certificates in a generic way, and you are expected to show that the instrument used actually demonstrate the credible low carbon supply aligned with then when the electricity is consumed. Yes, so overall, for many companies, this can have operational implications. It can involve a procurement strategy or documentation on audibility of these certificates in a different way. This is a scope where we've seen that most companies move the fastest, so they get their targets the fastest, but it is good to note about these new requirements for these certificates. Moving on to scope 3. This is where the draft introduces big structural changes. The draft describes a focused and flexible scope 3 framework, essentially. So meaning that the intent is to keep the ambition for the net zero and also for the value chain emissions, which are often the most biggest for companies, but also avoiding the one size fits all requirement that is kind of rigid and do not maybe help companies do the actual emission reductions. There is also so diverse value chains that this I think is a good update. So how do we then start with the target setting in this new framework is that you have a full scope 3 inventory, so you calculated all of your emissions, but then you continue to identify the significant categories and priority sources as well. And this could be that inside your category there is also some kind of priority sources that you want to look into. The exclusions that you will then apply to this target need to be transparently documented and then reported. You then select the target setting method and define then how actions will be implemented after the exclusions. And this will then align with the draft's emphasis also with the highest priority value chain emission sources. So we want to really focus on where there is emissions and not just to the whole scope, even though that you might do the emission calculation for the whole value chain in the beginning. Transparency here, I think, is the key takeaway as well when reporting and seeing what is excluded. Second change is that the draft expands how companies can set and drive these Scope 3 targets. So the standard acknowledges multiple ways to catalyze value chain decarbonization, including interventions at the emission source. There can be counterparty level activity. There can be activity pools with the supply chains, or then also sector level involvement that you do through partnership, or then just that the sector will decarbonize overall. And because there is multitude of different levers than companies can utilize, it then helps with understanding your procurement, maybe your supply chain management, product design, logistics requirement, and sector initiatives as well, which will drive the decarbonization. And this reflects that there is no one-size-fit mechanism for all categories, but there is different value chains and different levers that need to be inputted. There was a brief mention in the last standard about mandatory supplier engagement target, but this was removed now due to the fact that the consultation revealed the exact what we discussed, that the value chains are complex and there might be different levers that need to be done and not one size fits for all. But even though this is removed, the draft still expects the Scope 3 action and interventions or engagement with suppliers when needed and mandated for getting to the targets. But essentially the Scope 3 under this draft then becomes less about having a generic target statement for your Scope 3, but more about demonstrating the prioritization. You actually know where your levers are for decarbonization, and you've actually thought about the methods choice that you will take within your supply chain. And there is like this credible implementation mechanism. This will also require a better mapping of value chain, possibly about the emission drivers, and clearer evidence as well for the interventions and reductions. And this we see with companies as well, that sometimes if the emissions are calculated on a general level or using high-level estimates, you do not see the impact of your actions and levers, and therefore you cannot showcase the reduction that you've made when you actually do actions. So therefore, it is good to then focus the GOT emission calculation efforts as well to those categories that are your priority, and you know that you will want to decarbonize in those specific parts in your value chain, and work together with your suppliers to gather the more relevant data through, for example, EPDs or PCFs, or these more reliable emission calculations that you actually know then where the emissions come from. Good. Then last slide before our end part about the implications and next steps. So we wanted to also highlight the new framework, which is the ongoing emission responsibility framework. So previously, the SBTi focused on having the beyond value chain value chain mitigation and removal, and now it has been changed into this concept that has different aspects to it as well. And it is to do with what would companies do about emissions that remain on the path to net zero. We all know that companies do emit all the time emissions, and even though they do reductions, it is almost impossible to get to 100% of reduced emissions, and therefore this framework is very important for companies looking to reach the net zero pathway. I will go through these 3 points here. So the first is the disclosure, which requires, or there is an expectation that companies will disclose whether they plan to take responsibility for at least a certain minimum share of your ongoing emissions during the upcoming target timeframe. The point here is that there is transparency and comparability, not just that you have a long-term net zero endpoint and then you will remove the emissions that then are at the endpoint, because companies also need to think about the emissions that they can remove during the target period, not only at the end point. But this, of course, is not mandatory to do so. You just need to disclose if you are wishing to do this or not. Second, I like to highlight here is the recognition program, where there is 2 tiers. There is recognized and then leadership. And this is to highlight companies taking early action. This is also positioned as voluntary, where previously there was requirements. So this also showcased that it is now on the new consultation made a little bit less rigid. Yes, thirdly, the draft also signals an intention that category A companies assume responsibility for an increasing share of the ongoing emissions each year from 2035. So when we look at the long term. So progressively want to be building toward complete neutralization at net zero, not only at the end point. And importantly, the draft also notes that the post-2035 approach is still, of course, illustrative, and it's not yet clear and is subject to further consultation and finalization. So this is good to note that this framework is still an ongoing process, and they maybe will change some of or clarify points for the final draft that is expected to come now in the 2026 year. The actual framework in itself hasn't changed in a way that you still have that reduce aggressively first. So you need to do all of the steps to ensure that you reduce your emissions as far as you possibly can, and then have the increasing responsibility of the ongoing emissions on the path and neutralize those residual emissions when you come to the net zero year.
Probably we could take a few questions. We have many of them. Thanks. just with regards to the scope 3, we have a few questions, so want to take one here. So we have one saying that do all scope 3 categories representing less than 5% of total scope 3 emissions must be included in the target setting scope?
Yes, so essentially the emissions, if I understood correctly, is that you first need to do the full inventory calculations, so you know your emissions. And now it has changed. Previously, it was that you need to have the 90% coverage for your emissions, but now it's more focusing on the priority emissions. And I have to look that 5% threshold as well, so I can come back to that. But I think it wasn't as strict.
Yeah, that's good, because we have a few other questions for especially the 5% threshold for emission categories. So let's elaborate that later.
Good. Do we move on, or is there some other questions for scope 3 or scope 1, 2?
There was also one that when setting a near-term scope 3 target, how does the SBTi determine that a supplier is committed? So can all suppliers whose status is targets set or committed be included? And does the type of commitment matter? For example, if the supplier's target type is also engagement. So what is taken into account?
Yes, so it of course does matter that the set is it that you've set the targets or you validated the targets. But of course now when we move into the new draft, in the supply chain, if the targets you have enhanced, that your suppliers will also validate their targets based on the SBTi, you are encouraged to also help them do a transition plan for the targets. And we will go into that in the third phase as well here now soon, is about the transition plan. So I think the SBTi is emphasizing the transition plans, and if you are a large company or you have influence in your supply chains, you will help those suppliers set those transition plans. But this is not a requirement from them. So the smaller companies are not required to set transition plans, but it still is a good recommendation. Good. Okay, then in our next phase, we are looking into how then this affects a company setting targets, for example, the first time, or then resubmitting, or what are then the implications for companies. And in practice, we recommend you to then analyze if you are a category A or category B company in the beginning, which is kind of the central vision in here on the draft. And as mentioned previously, the category A includes the large companies globally, and also medium-sized companies operating in high-income countries. Even though you would be a medium company, you still might be a category A. Category B covers smaller companies, medium-sized companies in lower income regions. And then there is different perspectives and mandatory requirements for the companies. For example, one of them is the transition plan, which is mandatory for the large or the category A companies. There is also a mandatory near-term scope 3 targets and the mandatory long-term scope 1 and 2 targets. Also, the validation timeline is shorter for the category A companies. For the smaller companies then, so category B, they face more flexibility with those elements or optionality, and they also have a longer validation timeline. Good. Then if we move into companies with existing commitments or already validated targets, so these targets remain valid for now, but from 2028 onwards, if there are any updates or revalidations, they need to follow the new version, so 2.0, and the final version of it that will be published during this year. It is worth now then, therefore, planning ahead. If you know that you have your next update window approaching or coming, to really think about strategically as well, that do you want to update them using the existing framework or then the new one. For companies setting new targets in the next couple of years, you can still use the current standard, but of course note that there is only the 2 years window here. But there can be also strategic advantages in aligning early with the direction of the new standard, and it can reduce the risk of needing major revisions later as well. So that's good to note. And the new standard, even though it is of course work and you need to deep dive into the changes, and there is, for example, the scope 1 and 2 separation of targets, but essentially still the revisions can also help companies. They can create clearer pathways and make it more understandable to reach your targets, not only set them. Transition plan then is also a key differentiator. So many companies already have transition plans, but there is still a kind of gap in the market that the plans are not yet either full or coherent, and they are not end-to-end roadmaps. So there might be some actions, some levers recognized, but the linkage between targets and quantified levers and the financing of it is still missing. So to ensure a full transition plan, many still need to work on the financial side and understanding the investments as well for the milestones. There is also, of course, still many assumptions, and there will be going forward as well. So this is something that is inherent to transition plans as well. The longer time frame you have, the more assumptions you need to also make. But as well as you can, especially for the near term, it would be good to try to think about the targets and levers and the quantification of those. Scope 3 is also very difficult for many companies to track consistently over time, and they have been in the past many times kind of been engaging with suppliers and doing the right things, but as previously mentioned, it might not show in the data if the data quality is not reflecting of it. Then for companies without a transition plan yet, the practical focus would be especially using the current market about the transition plan, so we see an increasing need for them, and clarifying within your organization the roles and responsibilities of who should set the transition plan, who would be responsible of doing the roadmap to those targets. And this could be important because if you have a target, you cannot just assume that you will get to that target. So previously, the SBTi hasn't required this kind of plan or roadmap for the target at this level. So therefore, it is good to now really revisit those plans and see the new guidances that have come about the transition plans. It will ground them and ensure that there is a real pathway and feasibility to that target. Good. Then I also would want to highlight that due to the fact that there hasn't been maybe that clear linkage and the pathway towards the targets, many companies are seeing underperformance. So the near targets are closing in and maybe you are not reaching to those. There is some research that has shown that even about 40% of SBTi targets set, the near-term targets, they are not going to be managed, or you will not get to those targets due to the fact that there is no clear pathways towards them. And of course, there is the all kinds of different assumptions, estimations that are in force as well that impact the markets. But therefore, SBTi also in this new draft introduced this topic of ways to address underperformance. They first introduced this as something that you do need to take into consideration, but based on the consultation feedback, they removed here, for example, the fact that you would be required to use these ways to address your underperformance. Essentially now this is more of an optional way of looking at them, and you do not have any penalties even if you do not get to your targets. I think this is a good way to showcase it, to understand that if you overshoot your target, even though it is overshoot, you can still bring it back by utilizing different market mechanisms, removals, etc., or then just the way you are reducing it, you do it in a more faster way, for example, to correct that overshoot that you have. But this is not mandatory. These are just ways to utilize if you are experiencing it, and this can give some structure as well on how you would deal with such overshoots. Yes.
So, conscious of time, I think we have 1 minute left. So, and we have a lot of questions here. We will just saying now before everybody leaves that we will collect Q&A and send it via email after this.
Good. Webinar. Yes. Our final slide here would have been about the transition plans, but we discussed this already. But I will move into the end slide. Thank you for your time in the webinar, and we will come back with response to any questions.
Yes, and should you have any questions, still feel free to contact us via email, and if you wish to get the presentation material, that can be also delivered upon request. So thank you everybody, and thanks for joining the webinar, and enjoy the rest of the day and the weekend ahead. Thank you.